Welcome to the Determined Truth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, we've arrived. Look around. We're in the New Jerusalem. We're here. It's beautiful. It's glorious. And what is it, Rob? What if we were to picture the New Jerusalem? We're in Revelation, starting chapter 21, verse 9, and we'll see how far we get through this today. What do we think the New Jerusalem is? What do you is it just Michelin babies floating on clouds?
Michelin babies.
The Michelin babies.
I don't know.
Did they have those commercials where they were like in the clouds in heaven?
No, I don't remember that. So sorry.
Okay. I hope because I've been saying my go-to thing in classes, like I talk about how heaven's not like Michelin babies and heaven in clouds. People laugh. Maybe they're just laughing at me.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, they're laughing with you, Vinny.
No, they're laughing at me, not with me.
Yeah, they want you to think they're laughing with you.
Yeah.
So for John, the New Jerusalem is the eternal dwelling place for God and for His people, where they dwell in the presence of God on a restored earth and new creation. And John describes it like a garden city. It's Eden, glorified. There's a tree of life and there's a river of life flowing through it. But if you're asking me, I wouldn't describe it that way. For me, there's gonna have to be a Ghirardelli ice cream shop somewhere nearby. There's gonna, because you need that after your round of golf. There's gonna be some great golf courses. And I love desert golf courses here in Arizona, but I also like the tree-lined golf courses, like up in Michigan, that for 1 month out of the year when the weather's good, you can play. So I want tree-lined golf courses with maybe light humidity, theme parks with water slides, so my grandkids and I can go down the water slides together and splash. The water's going to be warm. New York-style pizza. It's the only thing from New York that I would actually advocate for. New York style pizza, warm, sunny weather, no cloud, maybe a cloud here and there. And you're like, oh, where's the sun? You know, but maybe a cabin like home where my family and kids were all together and play games every night. That is the New Jerusalem. How about you?
I'm imagining beautiful hills, like with trees and whatnot, windy hills where you could go on endless miles of Harley Davidson
motorcycle rides. Yeah.
Yes. So if you're from Northern California, that section is Highway 35. It's the section in the peninsula that separates like mountain from Saratoga all the way up to the Foster City, and you could ride up Skyline Boulevard, whatever that is, where you could see like Half Moon Bay on the left hand.
Isn't in the New Jerusalem.
Well, it is, because I've been told in a class once the New Jerusalem is going to be 100 miles in a square. And so it goes from California to like Denver or something like that. It's a box.
Oh, is that okay? Yeah, because it's clearly North American, 1,500 miles.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So if we could get the California coast, so I could do motorcycle rides. And I've never lived in Texas. They say they're the greatest at everything. If we can have maybe like some Texas barbecue where they're serving brisket and beef ribs.
No Texas, no New York, but we want New York style
food
pizza and Texas barbecue. Yeah, no Italy, but we'll take the Italian food and French bread. So
exactly. Yeah. So for me, that might be. You watch Field of Dreams. We're both baseball fans, so you know, is this heaven? No, it's Iowa. No, but baseball fields will be there.
That's what I'm thinking. But I think that's important.
Speaking of which, I got to take a motorcycle ride after this. I'm taking the day off work. I'm going to take a motorcycle ride to Oakland and watch a doubleheader.
Oh,
so I wanted to have
a minor league game.
I was going to say I wanted to be alone today, so I'm going to go to the A's game.
Every foul ball, you're like, I'm not getting that one.
it will be me and 26 guys from each team. So.
Yeah, very good. The reason why I was saying that's important is because I think we have to understand this is what John's doing. He's describing the New Jerusalem as this glorified Edenic city, temple, place. That doesn't mean that what he's describing is actually the way the gates aren't actually pearls, most likely.
Where would you find a
actually
clam
gold?
That big? That's my question. You have these 12-foot pearls. How big of a clam is that, man?
How do you know it's 12 foot?
Is that what it says? I thought it's 12.
No, the wall of the city is 144 cubits thick.
That's true.
And it's 1,200 miles high.
Sheesh,
So that's, or 1,400 miles high. So that's, or to 1,500 miles. Yeah, that's the mother of all pearls.
Well, and you got to find 12 of those. 12 of those clams.
Yes, all things are possible through Christ Jesus.
I just don't have enough faith. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know some prosperity teachers that probably have stuff like that. So yeah.
Okay. So as we look at the New Jerusalem, what are some key features that we look for? And we always tend to start with this before we jump into a passage. We set the stage to say, how should we look at this passage?
Okay. So I've come up with a list of 12 items I don't know how that happened.
Yeah.
That we're going to focus on over the course of the next, I'm going to say 2 episodes, laughing, hoping maybe it's going to be 3. We'll see how it is. But the first theme is that it's Eden. It's the place of God's presence. It's Eden expanding and filling the whole earth. And that's really important. You read the book of Genesis, it doesn't say that Eden's going to expand and fill the earth, but it seems to indicate through the rest of the biblical story, that's actually what's going to happen. And I think the New Jerusalem is Eden expanding and filling the earth. Second thing is it's a temple, which we'll discuss a lot more as we proceed. It's a dwelling of God among people, and the dwelling of God throughout the whole creation and throughout among all people, which that's an important 2 themes because that's what I'm writing in my next book. And then it's a city, but it's not a city, it's a bride. And of course, it's a city bride in contrast to the harlot and Rome, in the ancient city of Rome. So it's the New Jerusalem is the people of God. Fourth point, it's economic reversal that we discussed a little bit in our previous episode, and that is that you'll eat from the tree of life freely, as opposed to the way it was in Rome, that the people in Rome lived lavishly, but all the slaves and servants and everybody else hungered and suffered. All right. Third point. I'm not very good at counting. Fifth point. Sometimes you go from 4 back to 3 because you just want to reiterate 3 again. But let's go on to number 5, Vinnie. So you're laughing because you're just as ADD as I am.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
yeah.
What I wasn't paying attention.
What did you say? The fifth item is that there are 12 uses of 12, which elaborates on the fact that this is a description of the people of God, because 12 is the number for the people of God. The sixth item is the parallels between the New Jerusalem and the account of the 2 witnesses, which is really interesting. The seventh item, it reveals the unity of the New Testament and Old Testament people of God. The 12 tribes and the great multitude, for example, are all one. We see that it's Old Testament and New Testament tribes, people of God together. And then the parallels with Ezekiel that we've alluded to a few times, but we'll discuss this more as we proceed. But there's a lot of Ezekiel imagery in the description of the New Jerusalem. Number 9, what's it going to be like? It's Eden restored. Will there be work? I think there might be. After all, Adam and Eve were supposed to work in the garden. Will there be golf? It's not going to be heaven without golf. Will there be music? No, but maybe you can have music. Just put your ear pods in so I don't have to listen to it, because you're going to be like banging on your drums all day long.
That's true.
Another question that we want to address is like, what about hell? What about the lake of fire? Is it there? Is it outside? We'll discuss that. 11th point, which we already discussed in the last episode, is that the New Jerusalem's already begun. It's really important that we're not looking at something just futuristic, but the reality is that the New Jerusalem's already begun, at least in part. There's still sin and death, but we, as the people of God, dwell in the presence of God because God's presence dwells within us. It's already begun. And then number 12, we need to ask the question, what does living in accordance with the New Jerusalem mean for us in the present? And obviously one answer to that would be holiness there. And of course, loving our neighbor as ourselves, because when we do that, we act like God. So those would be some of the things. So the 12 things that we want to look at as we proceed.
Yeah, that's good. And the good news too is in heaven, if there is golf, we know that we're all going to be scratch golfers, because since we'll be in our glorified bodies, we won't be able to have a handicap.
Oh my God. That's the dad joke above all dad jokes.
I'm cracking myself up.
I'm like, you're laughing harder than I am. That's pretty bad, by the way. You told a joke. Okay. We'll be back. We'll be back after this commercial announcement. This episode's brought to you by Spuds.
Sorry.
Spuds baking powder. It's also used for Spuds potatoes. It's all in one. Okay.
The Determined Truth podcast is sponsored by Determined Truth Ministries. If you'd like to donate for a tax-deductible donation, we need your support more than ever.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All right. Because we're like 58 episodes in and we just can't handle it anymore.
Exactly. Oh, that was funny.
Glad you thought so. Would you please, if you're listening to this, email us in rdalrymple19@gmail.com and let us know Was that funny on a 1 to 10
I
scale? Where would you rank it? So
if you thought that joke was funny, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast right now and say Vinny's dad jokes are the best. I'm here for the theology. I stay for the dad jokes. Okay.
if you've left the episode because of the dad jokes,
please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's I came for the theology. I left for the dad jokes. Okay.
I'm glad we got all that episode in. We'll have to finish this on our next episode, Vinny, but that's all the time for today.
So we've seen how important recognizing structure is for understanding Revelation. We've talked about this, if not every episode, every other episode. You're going to highlight this emphatically in your commentary. Your commentary is built on the structure of Revelation. What's happening in the section parallels in the contrasts with the great prostitute in this section?
That's one of the important things to point out. Maybe that's the 13th item on the list. If it wasn't one of the 12, I'm ADD, so I don't remember. Yeah, it was one of the 12. It was number 3. Okay. The contrast between the harlot or the great prostitute and the bride. So chapter 17 begins with one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me saying, come and I'll show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. Verse 3, he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. And we've discussed this a number of times, but chapter 21, verse 9, begins by saying, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues came and spoke with me saying, come and I'll show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. Verse 10, he carried me away in the spirit to a great and high mountain. So it's very clear that the beginning of each of the 2 descriptions of the great prostitute and of the bride are obviously parallel. Now, of course, they both end with John falling down before an angel to worship the angel. We'll discuss that again later on. But one of the key themes then that comes about from that is this theme that I mentioned in one of the 12 points. And that is this theme of economic reversal. They're going to eat freely from the tree of life. They're going to drink freely from the river, the water of life. And what we discussed in the last episode was that matters to the poor. That matters to the person in Gaza who right now doesn't have enough water to drink on a daily basis. And it's a reminder of the hope that someday they'll drink from the river, the water of life freely. That matters for the person in Sudan who's starving to death because of the war in Sudan. The millions that are starving to death to go, I can eat freely from the tree of life. That matters for the person in inner city St. Louis who doesn't have enough money to put their kids to bed with food, with a full stomach, and hopes that tomorrow they get to go to school where they can get a free meal at the cafeteria for lunch, and who worries, what are they going to do during the summer break for food? They can eat freely from the tree of life. And so it's this great economic reversal. And I find this interesting because one of the things that we said at the beginning of our study was there's really almost nothing in the book of Revelation except maybe this millennium idea that's not found anywhere else in the New Testament, and certainly in the Old and New Testaments together. And even the idea of a millennium, we discussed the binding of Satan maybe in Mark chapter 3, but just the 1,000 years of the millennium doesn't seem to be mentioned anywhere else. But one of the things about this economic reversal is that you see this in Luke, and we've discussed this before, but Luke is written to a wealthy man who funded the writing of the book of Luke, or the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And he writes about the blessed are the poor. Matthew says blessed are the poor in spirit, but Luke has this stress on the poor and the poor. Like Rob and Vinnie, I can't stand listening to your podcast because all you guys talk about is the poor and how it's unjust. If you don't like us, you don't like Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because that's all he discussed. But in Luke chapter 16, he tells one of the more famous parables, which is the only parable that he names a person in, right? And it's likely a parable nonetheless. But in verses 19 through 31, and it starts off by saying there's a rich man, and he habitually dressed in purple and fine linen, joyously living in splendor every day. And a poor man named Lazarus was at his gate, covered with sores. He longed to be fed with the crumbs which were falling from the rich man's table. And besides, even the dogs were coming and licking his sores. Now, the poor man died and was carried away by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. Now, in Hades, this is the rich man, he lifted up his eyes, being in torment, and he saw Abraham far away, and Lazarus was in his bosom, meaning Lazarus has the prime seat at the dinner table with Abraham. Verse 24, he cried out and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, which I find is interesting because the rich man still thinks Lazarus is his go boy. Hey, go get this boy. Hey, send Lazarus. He's my servant. Send him over here to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue because I'm in agony in this fire. Abraham said, child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things. Lazarus received his bad things, but now he is being comforted here and you are in agony. And besides, there's a great chasm fixed between us and you, so that those who wish to come over from here to you will not be able to, and no one can cross from there to us. He said, Father, I beg you, then send him to my father's house. It's like he's still my servant. Send him to my father's house. I have 5 brothers. They have to learn about this place, so they won't also come to this place of torment. I just paraphrased that verse. Sorry, verse 29. Abraham said, no, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. But no, he said, Father Abraham, if someone goes to them from the dead, they'll repent. And he said, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they won't be persuaded even if someone rises from the dead. So it's this great story of economic reversal. And again, it's not saying that there's no wealthy people in heaven. Again, Theophilus was the recipient and the funder of the Gospels. There are wealthy people throughout the book of Acts. There are wealthy people funding the churches. Aquila and Priscilla, the 2, I think, unsung heroes of the New Testament, who lived with Paul or brought Paul into his house. That meant they had a wealthy enough house that they could be known, and they were expelled from Rome. By the way, Claudius didn't expel all the Jews from Rome. When the Jews were expelled from Rome, there's 40,000 Jews in Rome. There's no way he expelled them all. He probably expelled the ones that were noteworthy, that were notable, that were prominent, that were involved in the instigation and the conflict. And Aquila and Priscilla were expelled. They were people of means. And there are rich Christians and there are people, but in the New Jerusalem, it's the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized. And I could go further on this, but obviously Jesus, the blessings and the curses in Luke chapter 6, blessed are you who are poor, blessed are you who hunger, for you will be well fed. Woe to you who are well fed, because you will hunger. There's that eschatological reversal, even in Jesus' speech in Luke chapter 6.
That's good. As we're talking about New Jerusalem and connecting it with Eden, we oftentimes think of the New Jerusalem in the way we think of stuff. If we have something that breaks, we buy a new one and it just replaces it. We might buy the same exact thing that we have.
Oh, yeah.
Oftentimes people associate the New Jerusalem just as being, it's just the Garden of Eden recreated. I think it's supposed to be better, though. It's not supposed to merely be the garden. Is it supposed to be something better than that? And how do we, there clearly is a connection between Eden and the New Jerusalem.
Let's look at a lot of the connections here as we proceed. But one of the philosophy courses I had, my MA is in philosophy, and I'm still processing a lot of my MA because I've had, okay, you know where my MA is from. And I'm like, okay. But one of the arguments that was made was that the New Jerusalem will be greater than Eden. We'll just put it in that language, because we've experienced suffering and pain and loss, and we know what it's like to suffer. And therefore, when we get there, we'll realize how great it really is, because we know what it was like to go without food, or we know what it was like to lose a loved one. And I think that still makes sense to me. And I think I would still buy that line of reasoning, that it's the restoration of Eden, but it's Eden redeemed. It's Eden restored and perfected and glorified. So I think it is better than Eden for those reasons. Absolutely. So one of the things that's important to note is that the New Jerusalem is the restoration of Eden, and this is what the prophets were expecting. In other words, we think, I thought you were going to go in this direction, Vinnie, when you started speaking about that a little bit, and that is, a lot of Christians have this mindset that this earth and heaven is burned up and destroyed, and then God just makes a new one, as if it's something separate and distinct from the old one. And what we discussed in the last episode was, no, he's going to restore and redeem the present earth, like the resurrection body of Jesus was resurrected. So also maybe we can conclude the physical earth is going to be resurrected and restored. I think we can get that from Romans chapter 8. But this is what the prophets were expecting. So let's look at a couple of verses here. I'll do the Isaiah 51 verse 3 if you want to look at Ezekiel 36 verse 35. Isaiah 51 verse 3, it says, indeed, the Lord will comfort Zion. He'll comfort all her waste places, and her wilderness he will make like Eden, her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the sound of a melody.
So Ezekiel 36:35, and they will say, this land that was desolate has become like the Garden of Eden, and the waste and desolate and ruined cities are now fortified and inhabited.
And Ezekiel 36 and 37, by the way. So Dr. Broadhurst, Jason, I did a live stream a few weeks ago, which by the time this gets posted, it'll be about a month or more earlier. You can find it on the Determined Truth YouTube page. It's under the live stream series of like prophecy. But we did a study of Ezekiel 37, 38, 39, and Gog and Magog after Iran attacked Israel. People were saying, oh, that's the end of the world. And we discussed that. One of the things that we discussed was these 36 and 37 of Ezekiel is clearly being fulfilled in the New Testament. It's the coming of the Holy Spirit. I'll put my spirit within you, it says a few verses earlier in chapter 36. And I'll change your heart of stone and I'll give you a heart of flesh. And I'll walk. And then all of a sudden it has this Eden language. Oh, look at this is the fulfillment of the coming of the Holy Spirit. Now let's go to chapter 47 of the book of Ezekiel here. And if you have your Bibles, if you're listening, pause if you need to and follow along, because this is really critical for what we're going to get into over the course of the next couple episodes. And I'll say a couple episodes. The plan's for 2, but maybe it'll be 3 because we're not making great pace because of the dad jokes that Vinny's bogging us down with.
That one was worth it, though.
But Ezekiel 47 is describing what we call this eschatological or end times temple. Now, in the present world, by the way, Israel's taking over the West Bank and Gaza is being annihilated. And the thought is, Israel's going to build a third temple. And it's going to be Ezekiel's temple of chapters 40 through 48 cannot actually be built on the physical earth because we don't actually have all of its dimensions. We don't know you don't know how to construct it. Furthermore, the New Testament is clearly telling us that this was fulfilled in Jesus, and then it's fulfilled in the New Jerusalem. And that's what we'll get into with the Ezekiel parallels later on. But Ezekiel 47 then, so chapters 40 through 48 describe this end times temple. And Ezekiel's going to measure it and do all these things here. They'll be important for what we discuss here in the book of Revelation 21 and 22. Verse 1, it says, he brought me to the door of the house. So it's an angelic voice who's showing Ezekiel what's going on. He brought me to the door of the house. Now, the house is clearly the temple. And behold, water was flowing from under the threshold of the house toward the east, for the house faced east. That's how we know it's a temple, because all temples face east. Water was flowing from down under, from the right side of the house, from the south of the altar. So water's coming from the throne of God, out of the Holy of Holies, through the holy place, outside the temple. Verse 2, he brought me by way of the north gate and led me out around to the outer gate by the way of the gate that faces east. And behold, water was trickling from the south side. So it's just a trickle of water. When the man went out toward the east with a line in his hand. Now, a measuring line means it's a prophetic thing that a prophet has to measure, symbolizing God's divine protection. So you measure the temple in chapter 11, and John's going to have an angel's going to measure the New Jerusalem in a few verses here today. So verse 3 again, when the man went out toward the east with a line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits, and a cubit is 18 inches. And he led me through the water reaching the ankles. So the water's getting deeper. Verse 4, he measured 1,000, led me through the water reaching the knees. And he measured 1,000, led me through the water reaching the loins. Now remember, rivers can't get deeper unless there's tributaries that are adding more water to it. But this water is coming from the throne of God, and as it goes out of the temple, it keeps getting deeper and deeper. Verse 5, he measured 1,000. It was a river that I couldn't ford, for the water had risen, enough water to swim in, a river that could not be forded. And he told me, son of man, have you seen this? He brought me back to the bank of the river. Now, when I had returned, and behold, on the bank of the river, there were many trees on one side and on the other. So there's trees. Oh, okay. It's garden imagery. Verse 8, he said to me, these waters go out toward the east region. So it's coming out from the temple. It's heading to the east. The east of the temple in Jerusalem was the Jordan River Valley and the Dead Sea. And he says, they go down into the Arabah. And Arabah is just a Hebrew word that means desert. They go down toward the sea. And so the sea here in verse 8 of Ezekiel 47 is the Dead Sea, being made to flow into the sea, and the waters of the sea become fresh. Now, let me stop. I'm sorry that I keep interrupting here, but the Dead Sea is not fresh water. The salt content, the salt content in the Dead Sea is something like over 30-something percent, whereas like I think the Salt River and maybe Utah, wherever it's located, has 6% salt. It is, I don't think you've ever been there, Vinny, but if you go to the Dead Sea, you cannot sink. You float. In fact, if you're like standing up in sandals or whatever, your feet want to like bob up in front of you. To stand upright, it's really hard because the salt content, the mineral content is so thick, you just float. You just absolutely float on the top of it. But the waters of the sea become fresh in verse 8. Verse 9, it will come about that every living creature which swarms in every place where the river goes will live. And there'll be many fish, for these waters go there, and others become fresh, so that everything will live where the river goes. And it will come about that fishermen will stand beside it from En-Gedi, which used to be on the shore of the Dead Sea, to Eneglaim. There'll be a place for the spreading of nets. Their fish will be according to their kinds, For like the fish of the great sea, very many, but its swamps and marshes will not become fresh, for they will be left for salt. By the river on its bank, on one side and on the other, will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, and their fruit will not fail. They will bear every month, which Revelation 22 is going to say the exact same thing here, because their water flows from the sanctuary, and their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for the healing. Now, John's going to say in Revelation, their leaves will be for the healing of the nations. This is going to be really important for something that we're going to get into later, to keep that in mind. The point right now is the prophets were expecting this restoration of Eden in the New Jerusalem. So I'll stop there. Any thoughts or comments that you might have, Vinnie?
No, honestly, I think you did a great job of providing the commentary and helping us understand the imagery of what's happening there. Because chapters 40 through 48 of Ezekiel are, especially in dispensational circles, always going to be used to see this is the literal building of the temple in Jerusalem. And I just don't understand how you see this as literal. And it's clearly using figurative language to produce a literal truth. But this isn't speaking about literal construction plans.
No, not at all. And in fact, I think we're going to get to this later on, but to give the listeners just like a little bit of a peek, when Jesus was crucified, they pierced his side and blood and water come out. Because Jesus has declared in the Gospel of John, I am the temple of God, and the water flows from the sanctuary. The water flowing from Jesus' side was an allusion to Ezekiel 47, and we can establish that more as we proceed. All right, so another feature of Eden that we're going to see in the New Jerusalem is gold. In the book of Genesis, it describes the gold, Genesis chapter 2, that was in Eden. In verses 11 and 12, it says, the name of actually, let me go to verse 10 of Genesis chapter 2. Now a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and it became 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pishon, and it flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. The bdellium and the onyx stones are there. Eden has gold, and of course, the New Jerusalem has gold, and the only 2 times the word gold occurs in the book of Revelation, interestingly, are both in the descriptions of the New Jerusalem, 21 verses 18 and 21 verse 21. Then we also, of course, have the river of life, chapter 22 of the book of Revelation, verse 1. He showed me the river, the water of life, bright as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb. Clearly, that's what I just read in Genesis chapter 2, verse 10. A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden. We also have the tree of life in Genesis chapter 2, verse 9. There's a tree in the middle of the garden. And of course, in Revelation 22, verse 2, it says not only was the tree of life there, but as I alluded to a minute ago, it says, verse 1, he showed me the river, the water of life, Revelation 22, verse 1. He showed me the river, the water of life, clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the middle of its street, on either side of the river, was the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. So you'll note, and we'll discuss this later again as well, that from Ezekiel parallel, John added that the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Ezekiel doesn't have the nations included in his description of it, but notice, of course, it's the river, the water of life, and from it the tree of life comes. And then finally, there's no longer any curse. In chapter 22, verse 3 of the book of Revelation, it says there will no longer be any curse. And that has to allude to Genesis and the Eden and the Edenic curse. We have this Eden imagery, this restoration of Eden, as we describe the perfection, glorification of Eden.
So let's reread verses 9 and 10. We're back in Revelation 21.
Yep.
So John writes, then came one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues and spoke to me, saying, come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the spirit to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. He said he's carried away in spirit. So this is like that 4th scene, because that's the marker that we've seen throughout the book in terms of something new is happening here. What's significant about mountains?
Okay, so this is where John's carried to. He's carried to a mountain, whereas the account of the great prostitute is carried away in the desert. And of course, the second scene, he was carried away into the throne room of God. So this scene here is carried away into a mountain. Mountains have a lot of significance in the Bible. Can you think of some examples without cheating if I put things in the notes this time?
I'm not looking at the notes.
That happened on mountains.
It did. Aside from my aforementioned motorcycle rides that we talked about.
In the Bible, biblical
Bible,
scenes.
got it.
I know your Harley ride was Bible-esque. Right. It was heavenly.
It was heavenly, yes.
It was heavenly.
Yeah. So the first two things I always think about with mountains are going to be Moses and Jesus. With Moses not only going on Sinai to have an encounter with God in the burning bush. What was the burning bush on Sinai?
The burning bush was.
Yeah. But then more importantly, the law being given. And then you have that parallel in Matthew chapter 5 with Jesus going on the mountain to give the Sermon on the Mount. So those are the first two that always pop in. But there's so many instances of things that happen on mountains.
So here's what I did, because I thought I would save myself some time. I asked AI, give me some Bible stories that happen on mountains. Okay. I could have come up with most of these, but why take the 10 minutes to do it when AI does it in 30 seconds?
Yep.
So obviously Abraham sacrifices Isaac on Mount Moriah, which becomes the site of the temple, at least according to tradition. The 10 Commandments, obviously you had Moses. The transfiguration of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus ascends into heaven from the Mount of Olives. Elijah's conquest on Mount Carmel. The blessing and curses of Israel on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Moses dies on the mountain, of course, overlooking the promised land. Mm-hmm. Two more would be the crucifixion of Jesus, obviously happened on a mountain. Mm-hmm. And then Eden, of course, was on a mountain. The Garden of Eden is not described in Genesis as being on a mountain, but it is in the prophets. Yep. You are on the holy mountain of God. And obviously, if it's a temple, which Eden was, then it's on a mountain.
Yep.
So mountains symbolize kingdoms and kings. Remember, the seven kings are the seven heads of the beast on which the woman sits, but there are also seven mountains in chapter 17 of the book of Revelation. The center of the kingdom, of course, was the temple, and obviously the highest place on the mountain was where the temple resided. So mountains indicate the place of temples. They're also the place of revelation. Moses on Mount Sinai. Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount on a mountain. The mountain, of course, is great and high in Revelation 21, verse 10, which is actually from Isaiah. I saw the Lord high and lifted up. And then Isaiah 50, that's Isaiah 6. And then Isaiah 53, it says actually at the end of it, 52, but what we often refer to as Isaiah 53, he will be high and greatly exalted. The servant has this language of Isaiah, but it's also from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 40, verse 2 that we just read. In the visions of God, he brought me into the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain. And there was a structure like a city there. But so mountains are places of revelation, places of the kings and kingdoms. They symbolize power. So the mountains were thrown into the sea in the book of Revelation. That's a judgment of other kingdoms. A lot of cool imagery here.
John's told, back to Revelation, he's told that he's to come up so that he may be shown the bride, the wife of the Lamb. We read that in verse 9. But the angel, instead of showing him the bride, the wife of the Lamb, showed him the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down from heaven. So this is where we start seeing things in Revelation where you hear one thing, but then you see something else, right?
Exactly. It's John's use of hearing and seeing that we found most explicitly in the description of the Lamb. Behold, the lion from the tribe of Judah has overcome, and I looked and behold, a lamb. So he heard the lion, but he saw the lamb. I think you use hearing and seeing with the 144,000 and the great multitude. He heard 144,000 were sealed, but he looked and behold a great multitude. Mm-hmm. And now John hears that he's going to be shown the bride, but when he looks, he sees the holy city because the bride is the holy city. It's the people of God dwelling in the presence of God, described in terms of a magnificent city, which, of course, if God would have given me the revelation, it might have been a great golf course with a pizza stand after 9 holes.
Nice.
And ice cream at the end of 18.
Really, though, pizza on the golf course, that seems...
But it's the New Jerusalem, so you don't get sick. You don't get an upset stomach. Because you can eat unhealthy, and it's healthy.
No lactose issues. No run into the porta potty after hole 10.
Yeah, there's no portalets on these golf courses.
I got a funny joke. This is not for the podcast. This is hilarious. So
all right, I'm gonna pause it then.
Pause this. So
right. Welcome back, Vinnie.
Welcome back. Once again, Determined Truth is a nonprofit organization. We desperately seek your support in these trying times. And if you want to contribute more, we have our edited footage. It's only made available.
We don't pause the podcast so Vinnie can tell his joke.
And trust me, you want to hear this.
Yeah.
All right, so verse 11 continues with John saying, this New Jerusalem coming out of heaven, having the glory of God, its radiance like a most rare jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It seems that this is not literal, but it's just trying. I'm thinking, what is a more beautiful thing that could be described in the ancient world, especially if I'm hearing this apocalypse and I'm probably poor. I'm probably one of the 90% that I've never even seen one of these things. I just know that these are supposed to be amazing because no one in my family, my neighbors, we don't own rare jewels. We don't own anything jasper or like crystal. So I'm just imagining these are probably like representative of the most beautiful things that you could probably imagine laying your eyes on. I don't, is that like in my first read, is that probably what John's getting at?
What's interesting is, so you have several images here to consider. You have 90% or more of the people of the Roman world that have never been to a banquet. So you're describing this magnificent banquet scene. Furthermore, most have never been in the temple, so they have no idea what's inside. And most have never been in a palace. So all these descriptions are things that, oh man, I've always longed to go there. I've always wanted to go. It's like me going, I've always wanted to play Augusta National, but I have no hope of ever getting to Augusta National. I've always wanted to play this famous country club, but there's no way I'm ever going to get there. So now John's like, hey, guess what? We all get to play there, and you're not a caddy. You actually get to hit the ball, and you get to attend it, and you can go in the locker room that's reserved for members only. So that's one of the things that's going on. What's interesting about the word jasper is that jasper occurs only 4 times in the book of Revelation. I found this very interesting. And 3 of the times are here in chapter 21, verse 11, 18, and 19. It's going to be prominent. So there's going to be a list of 12 jewels. The first one is jasper, right, in verses 18 and 19. And here, jasper is singled out. The only other time it occurs is in chapter 4, verse 3.
I was going to ask if that's what's the other time when it's talking about the throne room.
Yeah, but not only is it the throne room scene, but the one who was sitting was like a jasper stone. In other words, it's not just that there's jasper in the throne room, it's the only description of God on the throne.
Yeah.
Remember, God's not actually described. I described him. He's like a jasper stone. So put these two together now. Remember, John's not describing an actual city. He's describing the bride. He's describing us, the people of God, with language that's used only for God. And that goes back again. We embody the image of God ourselves, so that when we love like Jesus loves, it makes him known. All men will know you are my disciples if you love one another. Or in the book of Revelation, remember, Jesus' voice was like the sound of many waters. But then the 144,000's voice in chapter 14 was like the sound of many waters. And then the great multitude's voice in chapter 19 was like the sound of many waters. The people of God are described in ways that describe or apply to God himself. It's us imaging God so greatly, so magnificently, that the only way to describe us is with language that was only applied to God himself. So I think that's this magnificent. I don't think it actually matters what it looks like. It's just the splendor and glory of God himself. I think that's really significant. And then even to go back to the beginning of the verse, Vinnie, it says the glory of God resides there. In verse 11, having the glory of God. The glory of God is what dwelt in the temple. So in the Gospel of John, when it says we beheld his glory, it's the way of saying, remember, the high priest can only experience the glory of God like one time a year. We saw his glory everywhere we went. And it wasn't just the high priest, it was all of us beholding the glory of God. So the glory of God is the presence of God in the midst of the city. And so what's happening is in chapter 21, verse 2, it says, I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. So verse 2, the holy city, New Jerusalem, comes down out of heaven, and then it adds, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. Now in verse 10, I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of God from heaven, having the glory of God. So notice at the end of verse 2, it added, made ready as a bride. And now in verse 11, it adds, having the glory of God. And again, the bride and the glory of God are equated. So another equation of the bride and the glory of God. So it's the people of God dwelling in the presence of God. In other words, this is actually unfathomable for you and me. We cannot actually understand what John's trying to describe because it transcends our knowledge, our experience, and everything we've ever known. Remember, in the Old Testament, no one could see his face. But we're going to get to later on, maybe in the next episode. they will see his face. Like, I remember one, I don't know if I shared this with you or not, Vinny, but I have been studying the book of Revelation for a long time. And one day I was meditating on Revelation 21, 1-5. And I'm like, oh, we'll see his face. Wait a minute. That's incredible, because no one was allowed to see his face beforehand. And I think that's what's happening here. We can't actually fathom how great this is going to be. This is going to be better than Augusta National. It's going to be better than Reese's peanut butter cups and New York style pizza, even Chicago style pizza. I'm good with that too. If there's no New York style pizza, but Chicago style pizza, I'm good. This is better than Gerda. It's better than a log cabin with your family playing board game. It's better than all that.
Yeah, that's good.
All right.
He goes on in verse 12. It says, it had a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and on the gates the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. On the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Lots of 12s there. So obviously there's something symbolic with 12.
Yeah. In the ancient world, first off, a walled city provides safety and protection for its inhabitants. So if John's going to describe this as a great city, it's going to have a wall. Even if the wall is irrelevant, it doesn't matter. Because remember, the gates of the wall are always open. The kings bring the glory into it. No problem whatsoever. Doesn't matter if you're describing a glorious capital city like Jerusalem in a restored, redeemed, glorified manner with Eden-like imagery, it's going to have gates. But notice also, and we'll get to this again later, that the wall has 12 gates, and the first gate, verse 13, is from the east, because all temples face east. So, of course, east is going to be the first one that's mentioned. But then it has 12 foundation stones. The wall has 12 gates, which had the names of the 12 tribes. But then in verse 14, it has 12 foundation stones, and on them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And again, you see this imagery combining Old Testament and New Testament people of God together. So when we see 144,000, which we're going to see in a few verses here, and 144, but when you go back to chapter 7 and 144,000, it's all of God's people together, even though they're named as the 12 tribes of Israel. The number 144 tells you it transcends that.
Okay.
You didn't read it yet, though, right?
15 and 16. And the one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies 4 square, its length the same as its width. And he measured the city with his rod, 12,000 stadia. Its length and width and height are equal. He also measured its wall, 144 cubits by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. So with this is an interesting one, because this is, I mentioned earlier as a joke in the opening, how this is where the 12,000 stadia, and this is like the ways where I've heard, everything is a perfect square. And so this basically, the New Jerusalem is going to be the size of a square, and it could fit between the west coast of America and somewhere before the Midwest. So it's very literalized in terms of this is how big heaven is going to be. So are these obviously, just like with Ezekiel 40 through 48, is this giving us the literal dimensions of what we should look for in heaven?
Again, the fact that you have a number that's clearly symbolic, because it's, and again, the Greek is really important. It's 12,000 stadia. I know a lot of English Bibles read like 1,500 miles or 1,400 miles. And you can see just the fact that some say 1,400, some say 1,500. No, it's not actually exact. It's 12,000 stadia in Greek, and the number 12 occurs 12 times in the description of the New Jerusalem, which we'll get to later. So clearly the number 12 is symbolically significant because it represents the people of God. It's not an actual place. It's the bride being described as a city, being described as the dwelling of God's people in an Edenic garden-like temple city structure. So no, it's not literal. It's 12 to 10 is probably what it is. So 10 to the third, which obviously is Trinitarian, and then 12 being the number for God's people. No, the number may have significance because it was basically the extent of the Roman Empire, the size of the Roman Empire. So putting a map from like Spain to Palestine, that's 12 times 12 times, or I'm sorry, that's 12,000 stadia there. It may just be a way of describing that, and encompasses the whole world. And I think that's exactly what it means, but we'll discuss that on our next episode. So 12,000 stadia has the symbolic significance of the number of the people of God times 10. Now, going back for just a second here, and that is, note that the measuring of the New Jerusalem corresponds to the measuring of the account of the two witnesses. So John was giving a measuring rod to measure, and he's told, go measure the temple, the city, and the altar, but don't measure the outer court. And that's Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. And I don't think we discuss this a lot. I do this in my book, Revelation and the Two Witnesses, which is more of an academic book, but I discuss it a little bit more deeply there. But Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, measure the temple of God, altar, and those who worship in it, but don't measure the outer court, verse 2. Verses 3 and following then say, and I'll give authority to my two witnesses. And when you look at that passage, verses 1 and 2 go with the description of the two witnesses. In other words, the temple of God that's measured is the two witnesses. Okay. Now that would take too long for us to describe now. And again, I defend that in my book, Revelation and the Two Witnesses. But the only two times that John's told to measure are here in Revelation 21 and in the account of the two witnesses. In fact, the word measure occurs 5 times, twice in chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, and then 3 times in chapter 21, verses 15, 16, and 17. The fact that it's limited to those two accounts connects the account of the two witnesses with the account of the New Jerusalem. So it's the measure of God's people, and the measure symbolizes, as we said when we read Ezekiel 47 a little earlier, the divine protection of that which is measured. This is God's people under divine protection. Nothing can harm them any longer. There's no sea out there. There's no evil coming in through the gates. The gates are always open. It's all good. Nothing comes in from the outside. God's people are divinely protected. The city doesn't need divine protection. It just simply indicates that it's protected because they cannot be harmed.
That's good.
First off, it's a cube. I've seen apocalyptic literature from prophetic pundits that make it a pyramid because the pyramid's 12,000 cubits high and 12,000 cubits wide and 12,000 cubits deep and all. But it's a cube because the Holy of Holies was a cube. The Holy of Holies in the inner sanctuary of the temple was 10 by 10. This is 12,000 by 12,000 by 12,000. So it's the Holy of Holies. 12,000, as I mentioned a minute ago, corresponds to the size of the Hellenistic world. And so it probably fills the whole earth, but then I think is exactly what it does. And then, of course, the number 12 symbolizes the people of God. And there are 12 occurrences of the number 12 in the description here, but we'll get to that later. And then number 4, it represents the unity of the people of God, as we already discussed, the 12 gates and the 12 pearls, and then the 12 foundation stones representing the Old Testament and the New Testament people of God. So that's what's being described here, but not actually a literal city that's actually these dimensions.
Okay, great. So next week, we'll continue on looking at the New Jerusalem and just unpacking not the literalness of the objects, but the literalness of the goodness and the glory of God we can experience.
Yeah. And just again, as we said the last episode, this is what is the blessed hope for you and me and for many of our listeners in the West. It's okay. Life's pretty good right now. I'm pretty comfortable. Nice day outside as I'm on my back patio. But for people that are in desperate situations, starving to death, losing loved ones in war-torn environments, refugees, this is incredible. And so I think we need to think about that as well. Yeah.
Well, and even we joke about there'll be golf courses, will there be whatever in the New Jerusalem. What we do know is what you had mentioned earlier is the glory of God. We get to be the priests who experience the Holy of Holies. But instead of just a priest experiencing it one day a year, this is our new home where we live in that.
Right. Yeah. And I don't mean to diss, by the way, us in the West, because we still deal with grief.
Yes.
We still deal with pain. We still deal with loss. We still deal with, some of us might deal with hunger. Some of us might deal with insecurities or uncertainties about the future. I mean, that's part of our life as well. And there's none of that in the New Jerusalem. But I'm just simply for the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized, the refugees, the immigrants, the people suffering from war. This is even better for them.
Yeah, for sure. Great.
All right,
man. I will see you next week. And thanks for everyone listening. And we weren't joking, though. Leave a review and a 5 stars if you like this in Apple Podcasts. That helps things get going out to more people. So if you could, it's the end of the episode. We don't have another one queued up anyway. Just take a second, please, and just do that in your podcast app. And that helps us out as well.
Helps us. And we've gotten 25,000 downloads now. So
nice.
thank you. All right, I got to run. Take care.
Okay. All right, see you, man.